He watched her through the security cameras, putting food in her bag. Then medicine. Then supplies. His cleaning lady was stealing from him, and he had proof. So he followed her home in an unmarked car, driving through neighborhoods he'd never seen before. What he discovered in that rundown apartment building. It destroyed him. And then it rebuilt him into someone completely different. Stay with me, because this is the most powerful story you'll hear today. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Sometimes we think we see everything around us. We walk through our lives believing we understand the world we've built. But the truth is, we're often blind to what's right in front of us. This is a story about a man who thought he had it all figured out, until one ordinary Tuesday changed everything. James Carter was a rich man. Not just comfortable, but truly wealthy. At 43 years old, he'd built a tech company worth over $2 billion. He lived in a mansion in Boston with 12 bedrooms, more bathrooms than he could count, and security systems that tracked every single thing that happened in his home. Every door that opened, every light that turned on, every item that moved from one place to another. Nothing escaped the computers that ran his house. And that's how he noticed something strange. His system started sending him alerts. Small things were disappearing from his kitchen. A few cans of soup, a bottle of children's medicine, some crackers, a loaf of bread. It wasn't much, not enough that he'd ever notice if the computer hadn't told him. But it kept happening, always on the same days, always at the same time, and always connected to one person's access card. Linda Patterson. She'd been cleaning his house for 7 years. She came every morning at 7, left every afternoon at 4:30, and in between, she made his enormous house spotless. James rarely saw her. She was like a ghost who moved through his life, leaving everything perfect behind her, but never asking for anything, never causing problems, never even making enough noise for him to notice she was there. But now, according to his security system, she was stealing from him. James stood in his office that Tuesday afternoon, watching through the one-way glass as Linda folded his laundry in the kitchen. She was 52 years old, thin, with gray starting to show in her dark hair. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, the way they always did. And there, sitting on the counter next to her worn purse, were 3 cans of soup and a small bottle of children's Tylenol. He felt something twist in his chest. Not anger, exactly. More like disappointment. He'd trusted her. He paid her well, or at least he thought he did. $2,900 a month. That seemed fair for cleaning a house, didn't it? And now she was stealing from him. When Linda gathered her things and headed toward the side door where the staff left, James was already in his car. Not his usual black Mercedes, but the old gray Honda he kept in the garage for emergencies. A car nobody would recognize as belonging to a billionaire. He followed her through the streets of Boston, staying 3 cars back like he'd seen in movies. They drove for almost half an hour, leaving the clean, tree-lined streets of his neighborhood and heading into parts of the city James never visited. The buildings got older, more run-down. The streets got narrower. Trash accumulated in corners. Windows had bars on them. Linda's old Toyota pulled up in front of a brick apartment building that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and forgotten about. The paint was peeling, the stairs were rusty, and half the windows had cracks covered with tape. James parked down the street and watched her climb the outside stairs to the 3rd floor, that heavy purse swinging from her shoulder. He waited 10 minutes, his heart pounding for reasons he didn't quite understand, and then he got out of his car. The building's front door didn't lock properly. The hallway smelled like old cooking grease and cheap cleaning products. James climbed the stairs slowly, quietly, until he reached the 3rd floor. Through a window in the hallway, he could see into a small apartment. And that's when everything changed. Linda was there, but she wasn't alone. 2 kids sat at a folding table, a boy who looked about 11 and a younger girl, maybe 9. They were thin, wearing clothes that were clean but clearly too small. And they were watching Linda open those cans of soup with an expression that made James's stomach drop. They weren't just hungry. They were looking at that food like it was a treasure. Like those cans of cheap soup from his pantry, food he wouldn't even think twice about throwing away, were the most important thing in the world. Linda wasn't stealing for herself. She was stealing to feed her children. James stood there in that dirty hallway, watching through that window, and felt something crack open inside him. He'd spent 7 years walking past this woman every day, and he'd never once asked her about her life. Never asked if she had kids. Never wondered how she lived on the salary he paid her. Never thought about her as anything more than the person who cleaned his toilets and folded his sheets. She'd been invisible to him. Completely invisible. And now, watching her spoon soup into plastic bowls for two children who waited so patiently, so quietly, James realized he didn't know anything about the woman who'd had access to every part of his home, every part of his life, for 7 years. Who was Linda Patterson? What was her story? And more importantly, what kind of man had he become that he'd never bothered to ask? James walked back to his car with his hands shaking. He didn't drive home right away. Instead, he sat there in that unfamiliar neighborhood, watching people come and go from those rundown buildings, and asked himself a question he'd never considered before. How many other people in his life were invisible to him? That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing those kids' faces, the way they'd looked at those cans of soup. And he kept thinking about Linda, moving through his mansion like a ghost, taking just enough to feed her children, but never asking for help, never causing trouble, never making him see her as anything more than part of the furniture. The next morning, James made a decision. He was going to find out the truth about Linda Patterson. All of it. Not because he wanted to fire her or punish her, but because he needed to understand. He needed to know who she really was. What he didn't realize yet was that by investigating Linda's secret life, he was about to discover something much more disturbing about himself. James arrived at his office early the next morning. He barely slept, his mind spinning with questions he'd never thought to ask before. He called his head of human resources, a sharp woman named Patricia who'd worked for him for 12 years. Patricia, I need the complete employment file for Linda Patterson. And I need information about all our cleaning staff, security guards, kitchen workers. Everyone. Salaries, benefits, family situations. Everything we have. Patricia raised her eyebrows. In 12 years, James had never asked about support staff. Is there a problem? Just get me the information, please. And Patricia, be thorough. 2 hours later, she returned with a folder that made James feel sick to his stomach. Linda Patterson had worked for him for 7 years without missing a single day. Her performance reviews were perfect. Her salary was $2,900 a month. James did the math in his head. After taxes, that was maybe $2,300 take-home. He looked up the rent prices in Linda's neighborhood online. Even in that rundown building, a 2-bedroom apartment cost at least $1,400 a month. That left Linda with about $900 for everything else. Food, electricity, water, clothes, school supplies, medicine. $900 for 3 people to live on for an entire month. That was $30 a day. $10 per person. James felt like he'd been punched. He spent more than that on a single cup of coffee at the cafe near his office. But it got worse. Patricia's report showed that out of 43 support staff, 28 earned less than $3,000 a month. 14 had second jobs just to survive. 7 shared apartments with other families because they couldn't afford rent on their own. And 3 came to work sick because they couldn't afford to miss even 1 day's pay. Patricia, James said quietly, did you know about this? She sighed and sat down across from him. James, yes. I've known for years. Why didn't you tell me? When was the last time you asked? Her voice was gentle but firm. You're a good man, James. But these people, they're invisible to you. They always have been. Not because you're cruel, but because you live in a completely different world. Those words hit him like a slap. James Carter, the man who'd built his company on innovation and efficiency, had somehow failed to notice that the people who made his life possible were struggling to survive. That afternoon, James did something he'd never done before. He drove to his mansion and parked across the street, just watching. Linda arrived right on time, like always. She went in through the side door, carrying her old purse and a small backpack that clearly didn't belong to her. Through the security cameras he could access on his phone, James watched Linda walk through his house. She went straight to the guest room on the 2nd floor, the one nobody ever used. She took out 2 notebooks from that backpack and placed them carefully on the bed, along with pencils and a small eraser. His chest tightened. Linda was using his house as a study space for her kids. While he was at work, they were doing their homework in his empty guest room because there was no quiet place to study in their apartment. For 7 years, 3 people had been living parallel lives inside his property, and he'd never noticed. James pressed the intercom button. Linda, can you come to my office, please? 5 minutes later, she appeared in the doorway. Her hands were still damp from cleaning solution, and there was a cautious look in her eyes that made James realize she always looked at him that way. like she was waiting for bad news. Is something wrong, Mr. Carter? James looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in 7 years. Linda had deep lines around her eyes and mouth. Her hands looked older than 52. She stood straight, but there was a tiredness in her shoulders that spoke of years carrying too much weight. Sit down, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Linda hesitated. In 7 years, she'd never sat in his presence. Please, James insisted. She perched on the edge of the chair, ready to run if needed. Your children study here. In my house. It wasn't a question, but Linda swallowed hard anyway. They're very quiet, Mr. Carter. They don't touch anything. I promise. It's just, there's no quiet place at home. The walls are thin, and there's always noise from the neighbors and the street. How did you know where I live? Linda asked, her eyes widening. I followed you home yesterday. Linda's face went pale. The food, she whispered. You saw me take the food. Yes. Her hands clenched together in her lap. I can pay you back. You can take it out of my salary. I'll work extra hours. I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter. My kids, they need to eat, and sometimes by the end of the month there's just not enough, and I thought, you have so much food, and some of it was going to expire anyway, and… Linda, James interrupted gently. I'm not asking you to pay me back. I'm asking you why. Why didn't you just ask me for help? Ask for a raise? An advance? Anything? Linda let out a bitter laugh that had no humor in it. Mr. Carter, with all due respect, men like you don't like it when people like me ask for more. I learned a long time ago that it's better to solve your own problems quietly and hope nobody notices. Those words cut deep. Men like you. Rich men. Powerful men. Men who see people like her as tools, useful as long as they work properly, invisible the rest of the time. The silence in the room felt heavy. Linda stood up. I'll get my things and go. You don't have to pay me for the rest of the week. Sit down, James said firmly. I'm not finished. She sat, but lifted her chin with a dignity he'd never noticed before. In 7 years, you've never caused me any problems. Never been late, never left work undone, never complained about anything. And this whole time, you were raising 2 children on a salary that barely covers the basics. Linda didn't respond. It makes me wonder, James continued, how many other people work for me in the same situation? How many other people are struggling while I live in luxury, completely unaware? He leaned forward. And it makes me wonder what kind of man that makes me. Linda studied his face for a long moment. An ordinary man, Mr. Carter. Most people only see what directly affects their own lives. The difference is, you have the power to change things if you want to. James nodded slowly. Linda, I'm going to make some changes. To your salary, to company policies, to how things work. But first, I need to understand the full situation. Would you let me meet your children properly? Maybe have dinner with your family? Linda stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. You want to have dinner at my apartment? If you'll have me. She was quiet for so long that James wondered if he'd offended her. Finally, she nodded once. Saturday night. But don't expect anything fancy, Mr. Carter. When she left, James stared at the closed door, his heart pounding. He'd just made the most important decision of his life. And what frightened him wasn't what he might learn about Linda and her children. It was what he would inevitably learn about himself. Saturday evening, James drove to Linda's apartment with his stomach in knots. He'd faced tough business negotiations, hostile investors, and media scrutiny. But the idea of having dinner at a simple table with a struggling family made him more nervous than any boardroom meeting. Linda opened the door wearing jeans and a plain blue shirt. No uniform. It was strange seeing her dressed like a regular person instead of the invisible cleaning lady who moved through his house. You're right on time, she said with a small smile. Come in. The apartment was spotlessly clean, but James could see past the surface now. The couch had cushions strategically placed to hide tears in the fabric. The TV was ancient, its picture slightly fuzzy. The folding table in the dining area was the main piece of furniture, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Mr. Carter, a boy's voice called out. James turned and saw a thin boy with bright, intelligent eyes. He looked about 11, wearing clothes that were clean but clearly hand-me-downs. You must be Tommy, James said. Yes, sir. Mom said you're the man who owns the big house where she works. That's right. I'm going to be an engineer someday, Tommy announced with complete confidence. Just like you. Actually, I'm a businessman, not an engineer. But why do you want to be an engineer? Because I want to build houses that don't fall down when it rains hard. Our last house fell down. James felt his chest tighten. When was that? Linda appeared from the tiny kitchen carrying a pot. 2 years ago. The building was condemned and part of it collapsed during a storm. We lost almost everything we had. The landlord never fixed the foundation problems. And your daughter? James asked, noticing the second child wasn't there. Sarah's at the neighbor's apartment doing homework with her friend. She's 9 and gets shy around new people. Linda set the pot on the table. It's nothing fancy, like I said. Just chicken stew with rice and vegetables. During dinner, James learned things that shocked him to his core. Tommy was at the top of his class in math and science. But he didn't have a computer at home, so he had to use the ones at the public library on weekends to do research for school projects. Sometimes the library was closed or too crowded, and he'd fall behind. Sarah loved to draw, but she used notebook paper because sketch pads cost too much. Linda had found some of Sarah's drawings, pictures of beautiful houses with gardens and families smiling in the windows. Houses nothing like the one they lived in. Why didn't you ever ask me for help? James asked again. In 7 years, you never said anything. Linda and Tommy exchanged a look. Mr. Carter, Linda said carefully, people like you help causes. You donate to charity events and write big checks to organizations. But actually looking someone in the eye and asking what they need? That's rare. James set down his fork, unable to eat. People like us, we're invisible, Linda continued. We clean your houses, guard your buildings, cook your food. And as long as we do our jobs quietly, nobody thinks about what our lives are like when we go home. After dinner, while Linda washed dishes in the cramped kitchen, Tommy showed James his school notebooks. They were filled with careful notes, drawings of machines and buildings, and math calculations that looked incredibly advanced for an 11-year-old. Where did you learn this? James asked, pointing to a complex equation. YouTube mostly. There are free lessons on everything. Except sometimes our internet gets shut off when Mom can't pay the bill, and then I have to wait until she can pay it again. James felt something crack inside his chest. This brilliant child, this boy who could probably get into any university in the country someday, was relying on spotty internet and library computers to learn. Meanwhile, James had spent more on wine last month than Linda's entire family earned. When it was time to leave, Linda walked him to the door. James, she said, using his first name for the first time ever. Why are you really here? What do you want? He was quiet for a moment, thinking. The truth? I realized I built my whole life on not seeing people like you. I convinced myself that as long as I paid fair salaries and followed the law, I was doing enough. But I was wrong, and I need to fix that. Linda smiled, a real smile that changed her whole face. So what happens now? Now, James smiled back. Now everything changes. Monday at 4 o'clock, I'm having a meeting with all the support staff at my company. I'd like you to be there. What kind of meeting? The kind that should have happened 7 years ago. In his car on the way home, James called his accountant. Tom, I need you to run some numbers for me. What would it cost to double the salaries of all our support staff? Let me calculate, about $700,000 a year. James almost laughed. $700,000. Less than he'd spent on his boat, that he used maybe twice a year. Do it. And Tom, I also want to set up an education fund. Full scholarships for any employee's child who wants to go to college. Do you have a budget in mind? James thought about Tommy explaining equations in a worn notebook, dreaming of building houses that wouldn't collapse. No limit. Whatever it takes. When he hung up, James sat in his car outside his empty mansion and cried for the first time in years. He cried for all the people he'd never seen. For all the Linda Pattersons of the world who solved their problems quietly, hoping nobody would notice. For all the brilliant children like Tommy who deserved so much better. But mostly he cried for the man he'd been. The man who'd had everything and seen nothing. On Monday, that man would die, and a better version would take his place. Monday at 4 o'clock, James walked into the main conference room of his company headquarters. 43 support staff sat in chairs that probably cost more than their weekly paychecks. The nervousness in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Most of these people had never been on this floor. They worked in basements and back offices, in parking garages and kitchen areas. They were the invisible machinery that kept the company running. Linda sat in the third row, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Next to her was Robert, the night security guard who James had learned lived in his car during the day. Behind them sat Betty from the cafeteria, who sold her own diabetes medication to buy school supplies for her grandson. James stood at the front of the room without a microphone, wanting them to see him as just a man, not a boss behind a podium. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know you're nervous. I know some of you are wondering if you did something wrong, if you're being fired. The answer is no. None of that is happening." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. "I'm here to apologize. And to fix mistakes I should have fixed years ago." James turned on the projector. The first slide showed a simple chart comparing their salaries to the cost of living in Boston. "I discovered something this week that shocked me. I learned that 28 of you earn less than $3,000 a month. That 14 of you work second jobs just to survive. That 7 of you share apartments with other families to afford rent. And that 3 of you come to work sick because you can't afford to miss a single day." The room was completely silent now. "I learned that Linda uses my house for her children to study because there's no quiet place in their apartment. That Robert sleeps in his car because he shares a single room with 2 other families. That Betty sells her own medicine to buy things her grandson needs for school." Linda's eyes went wide. She hadn't known that James had learned about everyone, not just her. "For 7 years, Linda worked for me perfectly. Never late, never complaining, never asking for anything. And the whole time, she was taking food that would have been thrown away anyway to feed her children, because the salary I paid her wasn't enough." James's voice got stronger, more definite. "That ends today. Not because I'm trying to be a saint, but because I realized I'm a hypocrite. I talk about innovation and changing the world while the people who make my world possible are struggling to eat." He clicked to the next slide. "Effective immediately, all support staff salaries will double. Starting this week, you'll all earn twice what you earned before." Someone gasped. Several people covered their faces with their hands. Robert started crying openly. "Second, we're creating a complete education fund. Every child or grandchild of an employee who wants to go to college will get a full scholarship. Tuition, books, housing, everything." Betty stood up suddenly and walked out of the room. James paused, concerned, but Patricia mouthed she's okay from the back. She'd gone to cry in the hallway. "Third, comprehensive health insurance for all of you and your families. Medical, dental, vision, mental health. No co-pays, no waiting periods, no complicated paperwork. Fourth, we're opening an on-site childcare center. Because nobody should have to choose between working and taking care of their kids." James looked directly at Linda. "Linda, I'm creating a new department called Employee Welfare. You're going to run it. Your new salary will be $7,000 a month, with opportunities to grow from there. Because someone who can raise 2 brilliant children on $2,900 a month clearly knows more about managing resources than any business school graduate I've ever hired." Linda's hand went to her chest. Tears rolled down her face. "But there's one condition for all of this," James continued. "I want your help identifying other companies, other situations where this is happening. I want to create a movement, not just a policy change." He clicked to the final slide. It was a photo he'd asked Linda for, showing Tommy holding up a drawing of a building he'd designed. "This is Tommy, Linda's son. He's 11 years old. He wants to be an engineer. He dreams of building houses that don't fall down when it rains. He's already doing math that I couldn't do. But he's been studying from library computers and worn notebooks because his family couldn't afford better." Several people were crying now. "Tommy is going to attend the best university in this country, with the most complete scholarship I can provide. Not as charity, but as an investment in the kind of person this world needs. And the same goes for all your children." James turned off the projector and walked over to Linda. "Linda, will you take this job? Will you help me turn this company into a place our children would be proud to work for?" Linda stood up slowly, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, they just looked at each other. 7 years of invisibility being undone in a single moment. "I'll do it," she said, her voice shaking. "But only if you promise this isn't about guilt or pity. It's about recognizing that we always deserve dignity. That you're finally seeing what was always there." James nodded and extended his hand. "Deal." When they shook hands, the room erupted in applause that echoed down the hallways, making other employees stop and wonder what was happening. Later, when everyone had left, Linda stayed behind. "James," she said, "why did you really do this?" He thought for a moment. "Because I realized I was building an empire on the backs of invisible people. And I decided I'd rather be remembered as the man who chose to see, not the man who chose to ignore." Linda smiled through her tears. "You know, in 7 years of working for you, this is the first time I feel like I'm working with you instead of for you." That night, James called Tommy. Tommy, it's Mr. Carter. You said you want to be an engineer, right? Yes, sir. Then get ready, because we're going to build houses together, and they're never going to fall down. He heard Tommy shout with joy, calling for his mom and sister. It was the sound of hope becoming real. And James realized that after 43 years of chasing success, he'd finally found what it really meant. 6 months passed like a dream. James stood in his office on a Wednesday morning, looking at the framed magazine cover on his wall. CEO of the Year, it read, with his photo underneath. Forbes, Fortune, and Business Week had all run features on him. He'd been invited to speak at Harvard, at Stanford, at conferences around the world. But that's not what made him proud. What made him proud was the photo on his desk. Tommy, now 12, standing next to a model of a building he'd designed for a science fair. He was wearing the uniform of the best private school in Boston, a school he now attended on a full scholarship. In the photo, he was holding a first-place trophy and grinning from ear to ear. Next to that photo was another one. Sarah, Linda's daughter, showing off her drawings at an art exhibition. Real sketch pads, real art supplies, real confidence in her eyes. Linda walked into the office without knocking. That was normal now. She ran the employee welfare department with 15 people under her, visiting companies across the country to help them implement fair labor policies. "Morning, boss," she said with a smile, setting a coffee on his desk. "I'm not your boss anymore," James reminded her. "We're partners, remember? Old habits." She sat down in the chair across from him. "I just got back from Chicago. 3 more companies want to implement our model. That makes 47 companies total in 6 months." James shook his head in amazement. What had started as an apology to one woman had become a quiet revolution. Companies across America were reviewing how they treated their support staff, raising wages, providing benefits, seeing their employees as human beings instead of tools. "Robert bought a house," Linda continued. "Did you hear?" James smiled. Robert, the security guard who used to sleep in his car, now owned a small house in a decent neighborhood. He'd sent James a photo of his daughter's new bedroom, painted pink with stars on the ceiling. "And Betty, her grandson had the surgery last month. He's recovering well. She wanted me to thank you again." James waved that away. "I didn't do anything special. I just stopped being blind." Linda tilted her head. "You know, that's not quite true. Lots of people see poverty and inequality, but most of them just feel bad for a moment and then move on. You actually did something about it. Only because you let me into your life. You could have just quit when I confronted you about the food. But you trusted me enough to tell the truth." "I didn't have much choice," Linda laughed. "You followed me home like some kind of detective." They both laughed at that. A knock on the door interrupted them. Patricia, the HR director, stuck her head in. "James, the reporter from 60 Minutes, is here for your interview." James sighed. He'd agreed to do the interview, but he still wasn't comfortable with all the attention. "Give me 5 minutes." When Patricia left, Linda stood up. "You know what I think is funny? You're famous now for being a good person. Like, basic human decency is so rare that it makes news." "It shouldn't be rare," James said quietly. "That's the problem." Linda paused at the door. "Tommy wants to know if you're still coming to his engineering competition next week. Wouldn't miss it. What's he building this time?" "A model of an emergency shelter that can be assembled in less than an hour. For people whose homes collapse in storms." James felt that familiar tightness in his chest, but it was a good feeling now. Pride. That kid is going to change the world. "He already is," Linda said, "because someone finally gave him the chance." The 60 Minutes interview aired 3 weeks later. It showed James's mansion, his company, and then cut to Linda's old apartment building. The reporter interviewed Tommy and Sarah, who talked about their lives before and after. Then they showed Robert's new house, Betty with her grandson, and 20 other employees whose lives had been transformed. But the most powerful moment came when the reporter asked James a simple question. "Mr. Carter, what made you decide to follow your cleaning lady that day?" James was quiet for a moment. "I thought I was investigating a thief. But what I found was a mirror. Linda wasn't stealing from me. She was surviving despite me. And that forced me to look at who I'd become. Do you think other wealthy people will follow your example?" "I hope so. But this isn't really about me being generous. It's about recognizing that the people who support our lives deserve to live with dignity. That shouldn't be radical. That should be normal." The segment ended with footage of Tommy's emergency shelter design winning first place at the state engineering competition. As he held up his trophy, He said something to the camera that made James cry when he watched it. Mr. Carter didn't just give me money. He gave me permission to dream. And now I'm going to use those dreams to help people like my mom, who work so hard and deserve so much better. The response to the segment was overwhelming. James received thousands of emails from people sharing their own stories. Other CEOs reached out, asking how to implement similar programs. Universities invited him to speak. Politicians cited his company as an example in policy debates. But the letter that meant the most came from someone unexpected. It was from a woman named Grace, who worked as a housekeeper in Miami. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Carter, I saw your story on TV and I cried. I've been cleaning houses for 15 years, and I've never felt seen before. Your story gave me the courage to talk to my employer about my situation. She didn't double my salary like you did, but she did give me a raise and help me enroll my son in a better school. You changed my life without ever meeting me. Thank you for seeing us." James kept that letter in his desk drawer. On hard days, when the business side of things got complicated, he'd read it to remember why this all mattered. 1 year after that first dinner at Linda's apartment, James threw a party. Not at his mansion, but at the company headquarters. He invited all 43 support staff members and their families. Tommy was there with Sarah, both of them dressed up and excited. Robert brought his daughter, who showed everyone pictures of her pink bedroom. Betty brought her grandson, who was healthy and happy after his surgery. As James looked around the room, watching people laugh and eat and celebrate, Linda appeared next to him. "Not bad for a rich guy who used to be blind," she teased. "I'm still learning to see," James admitted. "Every day, I find out about new ways I took things for granted." That's the point, though, isn't it? You're learning. You're changing. That's more than most people do. James raised his glass. To visibility. To dignity. To second chances. Linda clinked her glass against his. To family. All kinds of family. Because that's what they'd become. Not employer and employee. Not rich man and poor woman. But family. Imperfect, complicated, real family. Tommy ran up to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter. I got accepted to MIT's summer program for young engineers. Can you believe it?" James knelt down to Tommy's level. "I absolutely believe it. You're brilliant, Tommy. You always were. Now the world gets to see it. When I graduate college, I'm going to work for you," Tommy announced. "And we're going to build houses that never fall down. For everybody, not just rich people." James felt tears sting his eyes. That's the best business plan I've ever heard. As the party continued around them, James thought about that Tuesday afternoon 1 year ago. The day he'd followed Linda home, thinking he was catching a thief. He'd caught something, all right. But it wasn't a thief. It was a reflection of himself. And he'd realized he didn't like what he saw. So he'd changed it. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. He'd opened his eyes to the people who'd always been there, invisible in plain sight. And in seeing them, he'd finally learned to see himself clearly too. The measure of success isn't how much money you make. It's not how big your house is or how many magazine covers you appear on. The measure of success is how many people's lives are better because you existed. And by that measure, James Carter was finally, truly successful. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money or opportunities or even kindness. Sometimes the greatest gift is simply choosing to see them. Really see them. As the human beings they've always been. If this story touched your heart, remember that you have the power to see the invisible people in your own life. The person who cleans your office, who serves your food, who watches your children. They all have stories. They all have dreams. And they all deserve to be seen. Thank you for listening.